Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew, and these are my group mates Miracle, Connor, Mercy, and Keontae. Our presentation was entitled Crosstalk, and we are investigating the effects that a passenger has on the operation of an autonomous vehicle. To give you a quick outline before we get into the thick of things, we'll be first discussing our concepts and key terms. We have what we call our why section, which is us discussing why we cared about our topic and maybe why you should as well. We'll then get into our methods and our results, and then we'll have a quick discussion about the results as well. To start with our concept outline, we have the well-known by this point topic of automated vehicles, which we'll be abbreviating to AVs in our presentation from here on out. Now, who in the audience has heard of an automated vehicle before? We'll wait for a show of hands, and of course, there'll be a lot of people. Okay, so most of you have heard of automated vehicles at this point. Well, just to stick a definition to this concept, what an automated vehicle is any vehicle that is capable of navigating its environment without the input of the human driver at the wheel. So we all know about Teslas, but there are many different brands of automated vehicles. Next, we have this concept of the silent failure. Now, what the silent failure is when the self-driving technology in a car either shuts off or is not able to properly navigate an environment. And when those things happen, it does not warn the driver. So a traditional failure may be, the driving software shuts off, but it tells the driver that he needs to take over. In a silent failure scenario, the driver is not aware that the vehicle will not be navigating the environment, and this is the scenario in which we run our experiment. Lastly, we have this concept of driver takeover, which is in the name. It is when the driver needs to take control of the car themselves. And that is really the center point of our experiment. Was we were investigating the behaviors that happen during a driver takeover event. So next we have our question. Now the question we wanted to answer was, would the presence of a passenger affect the steering behavior of an AV driver during a crash? Now, do we have any ideas in the audience? So if you have a passenger in the car, do you think that your steering behavior is going to be different? And we'll see if we have any responses at that point. Well, our prediction was that drivers with passengers in the front seat will make a right turn in a subconscious effort to protect their passenger. Now, why should we care? Why should we study this at all? Well, one, there's the accelerating nature of the AV market. This chart here estimates a 31% growth in the AV market within the next decade. We already have seen how meteorically popular the Tesla has become, and it's expected that will continue to trend upwards. And at some point, we may have more self-driving vehicles on the road than non-self-driving vehicles on the road. Next, there's the fact that it's still an unproven technology. Out of every million miles driven by an automated vehicle, there will be about 9 crashes on average, whereas every million miles driven in a conventional vehicle, there will be about 4 crashes. So there are over 2 times more crashes due to automated vehicles than there are from conventional vehicles. This statistic is reflected in the public sentiment around the AV market right now. Pew Research estimates that polled that about 56% of Americans would not buy an automated vehicle. And if we look at this diagram here on the bottom right, we see that the top 2 reasons that people are not willing to buy automated vehicles are, 1, because they don't trust it and they're worried about giving it control, and 2, for some generalized safety concerns. In my mind, those 2 are really the same concern. People just aren't sure if they can trust the self-driving technology yet. Lastly, the U.S. Department of Transportation tells us that most trips on the road include a passenger. I'm sure that if I asked the audience how often per week do you drive a passenger, you could think of several occasions. Many people have children, many people have friends. It's maybe not rare, but it's much more common for us to be driving in a car with a passenger in the front seat. Ultimately, when you boil it all away, we care about this issue because it could help us save lives in the future. If we're able to predict behaviors with drivers, we'll be able to educate those drivers on the behaviors, which ultimately will promote safety on the roads. Now to discuss our method section. Whoops, I can't go backwards. So we'll talk about our participants first then. We had 7 Kennesaw students in our data pool. Among these students, there is an average of about 2.8 years of driving experience, with the youngest driver having about a year of experience and the oldest having about 4 years of experience. This is relevant to us because it implies that our data pool was relatively underexperienced compared to the average person on the roads. In future studies, which we'll talk about later, it would certainly be beneficial for us to have an older population, maybe some adult drivers or people with more than 4 or 5 years of driving experience on the road. Among our data pool, there was an average of 8.5 hours per week of driving. Every participant said that they drove at least 1 day a week, with most of them driving more than 1 day per week. And when you boil it all down, it was about an average of an hour and a half of driving per day per participant, which represents a good amount of time spent on the road. Almost between 1 and 2 hours, you can cover a lot of distance on the road, and there's plenty of opportunity for error, which is something that we'll be studying here. Looking at our equipment, we had a simulated driving scenario that we created using Unity Engine, and there was a physical simulator with a steering wheel that the participant was able to use, as well as a physical driver's seat with pedals for gas and brakes and everything of that. We wanted the participant to feel immersed in the situation. To accomplish that, we had a VR headset that the participant would wear to put them in the situation and help them feel as present as possible in the scenario. And there is a Skype call with audio on the right side of the chair, which is that's of note to our experiment. We'll talk about why in a second here. Lastly, we had a question pool that we created ahead of time. So let's talk about that question pool. We had a set of generic questions. These questions were not deep. They were mostly superficial. They weren't intended to get data on the participants. It was more just to get them talking. We didn't record any answers or anything of that sort. Ultimately, our goal was to simulate conversation. It was not to distract the passenger, or the driver rather. It was just to make them feel like there was a passenger in the car with them. As we said, approximating the presence of the passenger. We have some examples of our questions there on the right. Very simple things such as, what classes did you go to today? Have you traveled anywhere recently? And what's something that frustrates you on the road? That was 3 of the examples that we have here. It is important to note that when it was appropriate, we would continue discussion with the passenger through the form of follow-up conversation. We didn't want to just ask the question and then just fall silent for the next 20 seconds until the next one. If it made sense, we would reply with maybe a follow-up question or just some commentary. For instance, we had one participant who said that they had gone to the beach recently, and so we said, oh, wonderful, I love the beach, where did you go? Just to maintain that kind of conversational atmosphere throughout the drive for the participant. So to outline our procedure, we asked our participant to monitor the performance of the automated vehicle across 8 different scenarios. So there were 8 scenes that the participant would sit in, and each one there is a silent failure point that we knew of. The passenger or the participant was not aware that there was going to be a crash. So we waited until then, and then we would then record their behavior. Throughout the entire driving scenario, we were asking these questions kind of at regular intervals. Depending on the duration of the trial, it would be anywhere from 20 to 30 seconds. We would ask another question, just again to maintain that pacing. Let's talk about the results. We'll talk about our reaction times as well as our steering behaviors. We'll start with a discussion on the steering behavior. Ultimately, we did see more right turns. We had 17 right turns, we had 11 left turns, and 13 crashes. Now, these results that we pulled, these are only the pertinent ones. We had to disregard any false alarms, which is the event where a driver reacted before the event of the crash. If they felt the car was going to crash when in reality it wasn't, we did not count those. So again, we're discounting false alarms. We had about 20% more right turns total, which seems to initially support our hypothesis. When it comes to reaction times, again, we're discounting false alarms. We could not take data from a participant who turned 10 minutes before the crash or something of that sort. So we're just looking at the time before the actual impact in the crash event. We had an average of about 1.5 seconds, 1.6 seconds reaction time before the event of the crash. So in real life, what that would look like was if you're entering an intersection going, maybe 20 miles an hour, you have about 1.5 seconds before the reaction time. That is the average time it took for the drivers to react in these scenarios. Let's talk about these results here. When it comes to our conclusions overall, we found that drivers with passengers were 20% more likely to turn to the right. However, we're not aware if this is because of the protective instinct of the driver or if there is another confounding variable such as a distraction or the reaction time itself or something of that sort. And we'll discuss this more in a moment. When it comes to the possible applications of this data or future data, it would be very useful if we were able to educate drivers. If we are aware that if it turns out the drivers are much more likely to turn to the right during a crash event, we're able to educate these drivers, and awareness may promote safety. We'll also be able to modify the automated vehicle software. Say that Tesla publishes a study that says that drivers are more likely to crash in these scenarios. They, of course, could address it by perhaps modifying how the vehicle warns its passenger about crash events, or maybe the bias that the vehicle takes when it's choosing a direction to turn to avoid an obstacle. Lastly, in real life, we could also adjust traffic patterns and signage. the example that I like to think of is in a school zone, we know that there are much more likely to be passengers in the cars that go by on the roads. It may be useful if we find a significant correlation between these behaviors to adjust how the traffic flows through these areas to help prevent crashes, or conversely promote safer crashes, if you'd like to put it that way. Lastly, when it comes to future studies and information we would like to see, it would certainly have benefited us if we had a control group. That was just a limitation of the time. We were presenting this as part of a class project, so we only had a semester. But in future, it would be great to have a control group to compare these results to and get a true sense of the scope and the relevance of these differences. It would be nice to continue to narrow down the relevance of reaction time versus the turning behavior. Does one affect the other? We don't really know if the right turn was affected or determined by the presence of the passenger, or if it was something such as just not having enough time to react and the right turn was more comfortable. So in future studies, it would be very nice to be able to narrow down on these questions, again, by using a control group and perhaps by identifying some other methods to measure or approximate the presence of a passenger other than this kind of overtly distracting conversation that we had. At this time, we'd like to ask if anybody has any questions, and we'll see if they do, and if they don't, then thank you.